Hello again, this is Arti Maharaj back on the floor of the Global Ethics Summit. And in this version of Ethicast, I'll be speaking with Cormac Connor, partner at Husch Blackwell. You heard from Cormac's colleagues yesterday, Catherine Hanaway and Rebecca Ferdek. And today, Connor and I will take a closer look at the DoJ's heightened focus on accountability. So let's get right to it. Cormac, it's so good to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, happy to be here.
Thank you. So first of all, let's begin by just, if you could provide a brief background into your practice and just your background as well, that would be great. And then we can dive right into the questions.
Sure. As you noted, I'm a partner at Husch Blackwell in our white collar government investigations group. We handle all kinds of different investigations depending on in a variety of industries. It can really come from anywhere. I had previously been at other law firms, but then had been at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C. for several years, doing investigations on the prosecution side. But then the bulk of my career has been on the defense.
And it's great. It's great to have you here, Cormac, because I feel like you and I can have a very long conversation about this. So let's jump right into it.
Sure.
So my first question is this, and these questions, a lot of them were derived based on the questions we've heard from Bella members in previous times, and we've actually been hearing these questions come up during the summit. So the first question is, recent policy announcements from the Justice Department make it clear that prosecutors are implementing stricter corporate criminal enforcement policies with a focus on individual accountability. This shift has far-reaching implications for business executives and counsel, etc. Could you share a little bit more on your perspective on this topic as it relates to what you're seeing in this practice?
Certainly. So I think the big thing to remember is that DOJ's focus on individuals is really nothing new. Investigators have always been curious about not only if there's a corporate bad actor, but who the individuals involved may be. The thing is that it's harder for a prosecutor to make a case against an individual than it is against a corporation. There are different incentives involved, right? For each side, as a company is not going to go to jail. So it's a lot easier for a company to resolve a matter simply by entering into some sort of resolution, usually with a financial component to it. But people are facing jail time. And so the incentives for individuals to fight hard is much greater than it would for a company. What DOJ has done recently in the last few years is to really emphasize that they are focusing on trying to bring these investigations and identify the individuals involved. Again, not a new thing, but it is a new point of emphasis. And what I think that we're seeing now is larger pressure from investigators for companies to identify the actors within the organization that are involved in the conduct that's subject to the investigation. But when DOJ says that we want to hear about every single employee, there has to be some boundaries on that.
Right.
And that comes down to interacting with the actual prosecutor that's running the investigation, because in all likelihood, they don't want to know about every single employee that may have ever overheard a conversation at the law firm. They really want to know who the senior members of the organization are involved. And that's ends up being what our investigation work and our defensive work focuses.
So I'm going to double click on the last point that you mentioned there and just branch off into the second part of this question. So with that in mind, how can companies create effective incentives or punishments to encourage ethical behavior? And by the way, folks, we have a lot of data on this topic available to you right in our virtual setting. So I'll share more about that in a bit. But coming back to you, Cormac, what are your thoughts on that?
So it's hard. There's really no one size fits all solution, because every package has to be tailored to each particular business and each particular company. For example, the same compliance program and set of incentives or disincentives for an oil and gas company is going to be different for an apparel company, right? So there's just different issues in play. But I think the features that companies should be keeping in mind are starting at the top and setting the right tone, and as DOJ and compliance professionals refer to it as that tone at the top of the culture, and making sure that the culture is strong. And that includes making sure that you have a robust code of conduct, that it is accessible. It's not something that's gathering dust on a shelf somewhere where no one can find it, but that it's repeatedly referenced, that it's a part of the employee's experience at the organization. That there are multiple paths by which employees who may have noticed misconduct are able to report it. And that means not just having one person, because maybe the employee has a problem with that one person, right? So they need to have multiple paths to make anonymous and non-anonymous reports. And that, again, helps to build that culture, and then making sure that the employees know that those reports are being taken seriously is, again, a component of this. So when you talk into more, getting a little bit more granular, looking at the ways to incentivize compliant conduct is going to be making sure that employees know that promotions are going to be connected to, ensuring that they are not involved in misconduct that creates risk for the company. And it's obviously not a great thing if an employee is participating in bribery or something like that leads to an investigation, and then the next year they get a promotion, right? That doesn't send the right message. So,
right.
Again, making sure that's a key part of the each employee's compensation package and the metrics that are used for promotions.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned compensation packages, so that would be another component, is to ensure that for each employee's contract, whether it's a contract, whether it's their expectations for what their compensation is going to be, to make sure that a factor in assessing bonuses, raises, bump ups, anything like that may result in money in that employee's pocket, that a factor in the analysis is their compliant conduct or lack thereof. So again, it's hard to say with specificity for any particular business, but having those metrics so that when decisions are made that affect employee compensation, that the employee knows that one of the pieces of the pie involves conduct.
And just staying on that point, I'm curious to get your thoughts on just the fact that we're now in a virtual world. We are streaming live to virtual audience of hundreds out there. How does that create even more challenges for compliance? Just the fact that now they have to deal with maybe in some cases, a hybrid workforce or a fully virtual workforce.
As someone who is involved when things go bad, right? I handle investigations. It's frightening to me, to be honest, because at least when you're in an in-person setting, there's a greater opportunity, greater ability for supervisors and managers to check in with people and see what they're doing, and for people that have questions to lean across the table and ask questions of their colleagues. Not impossible to be done in a remote environment, but you're now dispersing people into places that you don't necessarily know where everybody is.
Exactly.
And so it creates challenges for data security. It creates challenges for confidentiality of business, important business records or business secrets or strategic thinking, things like that. If somebody's calling in from a Starbucks,
That's
right?
true.
You just don't know who's listening. So for me, it again is something that is always a challenge in the investigative space. It becomes a challenge when I'm trying to do interviews of people who, maybe they don't want to turn their camera on. And what kind of message does that send? Or if they choose to take an interview about a serious compliance issue and you can tell that they're sitting by their pool, what message does that send? Can we trust them?
Yes, exactly.
So again, it creates a lot of different new challenges that didn't exist, at least not as many of them a couple of years ago. We will get through it, obviously, and figure all of that out. But these are definitely new things that we're experiencing.
Over time, the technology is getting better. Our ability to train and share, but disperse stronger communications are all getting better each day. So hopefully soon we'll be able to get ahead of this, but it remains a constant challenge for me because it's certainly ever changing. Coming back to the Justice Department, when making charging decisions, the Justice Department will now consider whether a company has developed compliance promoting criteria within its compensation system. and will also require all companies seeking resolutions with the department to develop and implement such criteria in order to get credit for corporation. What's your advice to companies seeking to develop this criteria under the new initiatives?
So I think the criteria is something that you want to make sure that if you're looking ahead to say, if something bad happens, and if maybe nothing bad happens, but you're caught up in an investigation, and the question comes to you, what have you been doing to incentivize compliant conduct? How are you going to answer that? And do you have a good answer? And do you have one that is backed up by not only your corporate records, your documents, your policies, but if investigators want to go talk to managers or employees, that they're all going to be singing the same song. And they're all going to be talking about how important compliance is in this company, because not because they're being coached up at the last minute, but because it's ingrained in them. And so, again, making sure, as I mentioned before, when you talk about compliance programs and codes of conduct, making sure that those are well publicized within the organization, making sure that the tone at the top is explicit from senior ranking officers, board members, that when you have trainings, that the CEO is there, that the CFO is there, that the senior officers in the organization are present and are making sure that everyone can see them. It's that sort of conspicuousness that I think is going to be helpful as companies are sort of retooling or adjusting their compliance programs to be ready if the worst happens, right? If DOJ does come knocking. But again, it's my mantra is always to be telling companies to put the pieces in place so that if you get the question, you have an answer, and it makes sense, and it's not, can we see if DOJ says, can we see a copy of corporate code of conduct or your company's code of conduct, and you lean over to hand them the code of conduct, and it's 15 years old, right? It hasn't been touched. That's not a good sign, right? It doesn't tell the investigators that you're serious. So again, it's thinking about if you were facing those kinds of questions, how are you going to be able to answer them, and if you put the pieces in play to be able to do so.
And clearly, consistency is key. So you have to remain consistent with all of your actions.
Well, consistent plus, the reevaluation and sort of the doing
going
the
back
audits.
To the drawing board, always
Exactly.
rethinking and figuring out new ways to be innovative.
Right.
Yes.
The world is moving so quickly, and risks change so fast that you can't count on the compliance program from 2020 to be applicable in 2023. And so there just needs to be, again, that auditing process and dusting it off every year or so to make sure that you've reevaluated the compliance environment that you're currently in, and making sure that your policies reflect.
Yeah. Just moving on to the final point and the final question. So on the topic of to report or not to report, could you talk more about the Justice Department's revised self-disclosure policy and expansion of this concept into the FCP and other criminal investigations by the DOJ? Actually, I have the second part of this. So some fear that it allows bad actors to game the system, and the revised policy reshapes the terrain more favorably for companies facing such decisions.
Sure. So this has been a really interesting development from this administration's Justice Department in the expansion of voluntary self-disclosure throughout the Justice Department. There's been, for a long time, been a leniency program is what it's called, but it's a program run through the antitrust division where if a company learned of its own involvement in those cases in an antitrust conspiracy, the first to report that conspiracy to the Justice Department would get a pass from criminal exposure and a reduction in any kind of penalties. So that ended up being a very effective tool for the antitrust division in, essentially deputizing the co-conspirators, because any conspiracy now, the members of the conspiracy would have to be worried that one of the members is suddenly going to get, have a change of heart and go report the entire thing to DOJ.
Right.
So it not only expands DOJ's reach, but it ends up, I would think, suppressing a lot of that conspiratorial conduct because of that fear.
Mm-hmm.
This is now being expanded throughout the Justice Department And at least on paper, every single one of the U.S. Attorney's offices is to have, if not that they don't already have, a program that will be publicized so that if you are going to make a report, you know what the consequences will be, you know what the benefits will be. In fact, there was a declaration published just last month for a coal company that had disclosed misconduct that involved bribery, and there was evidence of bribes being paid. But because that company had come forward and brought all the evidence to the government and it had been cooperative, they not only got a full declination from criminal prosecution, but they got a substantially reduced fine. And so I think that what we're seeing is that, and this is an evolving picture because the program is relatively new. I think the risk of gaming the system is relatively low because the reward that a company would get for gaming the system would be, a significant reduction in the exposure with DOJ. But oftentimes these investigations become public.
Right.
And then you have to be worried if you're the reporter in self-disclosure, if that's a word, making your self-disclosure, are you then buying yourself a class action lawsuit, right? And so there are pros and cons to all of this. And again, revealing the existence of a conspiracy does not guarantee that you're out of it, because if the DOJ finds, for example, aggravating factors where there's a risk to national security or to public safety, or if there's pervasive misconduct within the organization, or if high-ranking officials are involved, you can make the report and still wind up having criminal exposure. So again, it's not a clear path. It's not a get out of jail free card necessarily, but it does substantially reduce a company's exposure if they are going to make those first reports and then fully cooperate and identify all the employees involved and participate in the investigation. Again, you're signing up for a lot of pain, to be honest.
Right. There's certainly many layers involved.
Right. The cooperation part is going to be lengthy and it's going to be expensive, no doubt.
Right.
And so, to your question about whether you're gaming the system, you're taking a heck of a risk in exposing yourself to a lot of legal fees and potential downsides by making that report. So I do think at the end of the day, the reality will be that companies who make these reports will be doing so for the right reasons, because they are recognizing that they have a problem and going to DOJ to try and get it solved. And again, to get ahead of it, demonstrate that they're trying to do the right thing and make amends for bad conduct.
Yeah, and just to bring this conversation full circle, Cormac, I'm curious to know, could you share with us at least, 2 or 3 of your takeaways, or just kind of coming out of this updated guidance? What do you think companies should just be prepared for if we look ahead in the next 6 months from now?
Sure. Well, I think the cooperation aspect of it is going to be significant. What we're seeing in investigations that are being publicized now is that DOJ is giving more than I'm used to seeing deferred prosecution agreements, or resolutions to investigations that are short of guilty pleas. And I think that's encouraging, because it tells us that companies will get the benefit of doing the right thing and cooperating. Because I've been part of plenty of investigations where we were falling all over ourselves to cooperate with DOJ, and it still wound up in a guilty plea, and substantial penalties. So you end up wondering, was it worth it? Getting invited to dessert rolling by. Talk about
Sorry to be standing between you and desserts right now. That's okay.
Talk about a compliance challenge. But I think as we look at DOJ's emphasis on self-reporting and cooperation throughout the investigative process, I think the additional. So anyway, that is going to be a key part as we go forward of what companies and individuals do when they're facing investigations. Recent announcements about preservation of social media communications are going to be very
BYOD.
It's very, very difficult to anticipate where this is going to go, because I think that the reality is people communicate the way they communicate, and
Yes.
I think the best that companies can be doing is making abundantly clear to their personnel that external communications are forbidden, frankly,
Right.
and can result in, we talked about the consequences for non-compliant conduct. Um, if these communications, I mean, WhatsApp is, I think, probably the most
Right.
common that I see.
So external communication should just be clearly defined on what is considered external
Exactly,
communications.
exactly. And the reality is, in our global economy, people communicate on WhatsApp, and it's
Mhm.
often their preferred method of communication, especially overseas. Uh, try doing it if the compliance regime can emphasize to employees that yes, you may get an inquiry from a customer, for example, over WhatsApp, you have to steer that back into normal channels,
Right.
and perhaps as an anecdotal example, if a sales rep for a company is receiving a request from a customer, to receive it on WhatsApp but respond in email,
Right.
and reference the WhatsApp message.
Right.
Preserving all of that stuff is going to be exceedingly difficult.
I'm sure.
I think that that is going to be a major challenge as we move forward.
Yeah, because every day when you think about it, there's no guidance on where should you respond. Someone sends you a message on iMessage. If it's more convenient to respond via WhatsApp, you'll do
That's
that
right.
in that moment and
That's
in
right.
that time.
That's
Well,
right.
Cormac, thank you so much for your
Sure.
time. It was such a great conversation. I know we're almost out of time, but again, folks, that was Cormac Connor, partner at Husch Blackwell. Cormac, I will be sure to invite you again so that we can have this conversation and continue it. Maybe we can do a webcast on this. I think that would be great. But
Sure.
thank you so
Happy
much
to
for
do
your
it.
time. Appreciate it. Folks,
you.
we'll be back to talk about best practices in investigations, remote investigations, and more. Stay tuned. More Ethicast coming up soon. Thank you.